So when we see our shadow, we see opportunities for growth. So as we go through each of these generations and talk about their shadows, there's an opportunity for growth on the other side, or an opportunity for them to, step into something more. And for, I want to throw this over to you. For boomers, that profit authority, like we tend to demonize that, but there's a lot of really good stuff that has come from that, right? There's a lot of vision that has come from boomers. Like Steve Jobs was a boomer, right? And regardless of whether or not you like Steve Jobs, but there was a lot of forward movement that has happened from the visions of prophets. And while they may or may not have been implementing themselves or allowing younger generations to implement for them, that authority is actually admirable in a lot of ways. So at this point, being used to having that authority, being used to being listened to, being used to being able to put your have people sort of organize around your vision. When a prophet becomes, they enter that time period of elderhood, if they can integrate that shadow part, if they can see that part, which is actually, it's for everybody's good. It wasn't just for me. It was actually for everybody's good. What is a piece of advice possibly, and an opportunity to manifest the best version of themselves in this cycle of life, do you think?
Yeah. And this is probably a good point to mention that integration does not mean like a surrender to the shadow necessarily. Cause sometimes that feels like that can be the instinct to say like, well, if this is something I'm repressing and you're maybe going deep into growth work, you're like, well, let me just lean in and give into all of it. And it's not necessarily the case either, but it's just an awareness that there's this part of you that is valuable, that is happening anyway, but you might as well be aware that it's happening and then have some control over it. So for baby boomers, I think it's like showing up. I think it's showing up to your family, to your kids, to your grandkids, owning that elder role, but then showing up in ways that are bigger than yourself.
Showing up to the show you didn't write.
Showing up to the show you didn't write. Yeah.
Like showing up to because I'm realizing you're saying show up. I'm like, what's the resistance? And it's because, well, it wasn't my idea. It wasn't what we put forward. It wasn't our values. So we'll just go do our own thing because that's what we agree with over here.
Caring about other people's ideas, caring about other people's needs, caring about other people than yourself, not completely dismissing yourself.
If I was a boomer hearing that, I would be very angry. You said that. Like, what do you mean? I care about other people's needs. I would think a boomer would be like, of course I care about other people. There's probably a nuance here that we're after. Well, like, it's not just care about other people, because I think they get that a lot from millennials, especially. Like, you don't care,
I'm not trying to be one of that.
Yeah, I mean, what I think the message for boomers, though, they hear is like, from millennials is you guys hoard your wealth, you don't give, you won't contribute, you won't play nice, you're selfish.
Yeah.
You hoard your energy, resource, and all of that. And that's not exactly what you're saying.
Correct.
Can I give an example in my personal life?
Yeah.
That might illustrate the point. So my mother is a boomer. My father was an artist generation. He's now passed away. But my mother is a boomer. And the message I get from her is, until I engage and interact with her on her terms, she has to wait to have a relationship with me.
Right.
So, and it's always communicated with great love, like I'm breaking her heart. So I'm no longer part of the religion I was raised in. And I know that this is extreme, so I'm not saying that this would be all boomers. In fact, a lot of boomers would probably find this somewhat offensive, but it's an extreme case that I think illustrates the point, which is until I return to the religion, I can't have a relationship with her.
Yeah.
And that's heartbreaking to her. And she communicates like she loves me, she misses me, but I have to basically play by her rules, or I have to play in the rules that she's chosen to play in. They're actually not her rules, they're somebody else's rules, which is what you're talking about, this shadow of socialism.
In a way, it's recognizing how people have made sacrifices for you, and then being willing to make more sacrifices for them. Not going extreme in the socialism direction of not doing anything that is important to you. But I'm starting with the idea of like your kids and your grandkids, like asking yourself, like, to what degree are you willing to sacrifice on their behalf? Right. Your time, your attention, your energy, and giving and supporting.
And I think this is the split, because I think boomers would say, well, this wealth that I've gathered, that I'm holding, that I'm stewarding, that is going to go to my children and my grandchildren. All the things I've built, maybe resource, and they forget, well, we don't want you after you're dead. We want you now while you're alive in a lot of ways. And I think that's really what you're speaking to. Well,
in some ways, I think the shadow is waiting for the system to give them wealth for them eventually. Like the old system that boomers have relied on, the TE effectiveness system that I was talking about, the system that they grew up into is no longer existing, or it's at least evolving or changing. There may be an expectation, again, if you're listening, this is up to you to determine if this is true, but this may be an assumption that if I have my money in retirement, or I have my time and attention in another place, that it's going to pay dividends for my kids and grandkids eventually via the systems.
Yes.
Right.
The 401k
instead of directly from me. And I think a lot of what you're expressing, what I'm expressing, we've talked about from all of our parents. Like, we have this idea that they're not going to come to us. We have to either wait for it to be their idea for us to come to them. And it's like, be proactive, make it your idea to go to see your grandkids, like be involved in their life.
So in the situation I'm talking about, it's like there's a system my mom is a part of, and I have to meet her at the system.
Right.
And it's an extreme case, I understand, but it illustrates the point. It's like we have to all meet over here. And what you're recommending is to let go of some of that and go, well, maybe meet your grandkids where they're at. Maybe meet your kids where they're at. Or at least meet them halfway. Or at least meet them halfway. And we actually have seen kind of a trend of grandparents not going and visiting their grandkids. Their grandkids always get brought to the grandparents.
Yeah.
And that is a bit of an older model. I kind of remember that a little bit myself, right? My grandparents never came. Actually, my grandparents never paid any attention to me.
Yeah.
Older generations of grandparents that were like barely paid attention to grandkids. Right. And I actually think boomers are more active in their grandchildren's lives than previous generations.
Yeah.
So they at least have that part down, that they actually are actively involved.
Right.
But there's still a bring the grandkids to the grandparents as opposed to the grandparents coming to the grandkids.
And the reason I wanted to differentiate the defensive trigger versus the growth trigger is because I know I'm going after everybody right now. Everyone's going to be a little upset.
Started with the boomers.
But it's not, I have no personal tie to you being upset. This doesn't make me feel superior to make you upset. But the idea is that it just gives you something to think about, and listen to your body and see if it makes you feel something.
Well, how many boomer thinkers, academics, politicians, media personalities, in my view, are still talking about things that they were talking about in the 1960s as if they're just as relevant in the same way today as they were in 1967, let's say.
Right.
But the world's changed a lot in 50, 60 years. I mean, it's a very different world than like the mid to late 60s. In a lot of ways, and yet it almost feels like we still have to go back into, maybe I'll just use one, academia in the same way of the professors of the 60s and talk about it in that way. Yeah. Otherwise it doesn't count. Like, you come into our turf in the way a prophet would talk about it, and then we can address these issues. We can't do it outside that system.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about making sure that this is not me bringing my authoritarian shadow and being insistent that you be something.
Sure.
When I understand that there's a sensitivity here. Like, you're getting older, you're experiencing and probably contending with your mortality. You're maybe trying to avoid thinking about what's next. You're very focused on what's been before, or what's been a part of your life this whole time. And what you want your kids to have is what you had. But it's thinking about the actuality of the way the world is now. And if there is a vision for creating a greater world, or something that is important to you, that is reminiscent of the world you grew up in, how can we then bring that ethos into how you can operate with your kids and grandkids going forward, as opposed to trying to turn back the clock?
Well, and there's so much to share, because boomers have lived through so much. Like we talk about, some of the traumas we experience in life right now, but boomers in the 60s, it's like hard to communicate some of the things that they went through in the 70s. Like, they have so much life experience, so much wisdom. They've seen so much. And I would imagine that archetypically, a prophet generation would very naturally rest into a sage role when they're older, to dispense wisdom, to dispense all the things that they've seen. And so in some ways, we really need them to not wait for things to come to them on their turf, but to be willing to be like a bodhisattva, right? The Buddha sits at the top of the mountain, but the Bodhisattva goes and visits the Buddha and then brings the messages down to the village. And we need them to be a little less Buddha and a little more Bodhisattva, a little more bringing wisdom to meet people halfway, as opposed to you having to go to the top of the mountain to get that wisdom.
And that's the integration of bringing the me to the scenario.
Yeah.
You're bringing yourself to your grandkids. You're bringing your wisdom. You're bringing your life experience. And I think that would be something very valuable for your family and legacy going forward.